Brought to you by BedroomBattlefields.com, this is the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast. Alright then, William, welcome to the podcast. Sorry I just fired in there just as you took a drink of water. People do that to me all the time.
It's okay, that's not a problem at all. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
No, you're welcome. It's been a wee while in the making. We've been back and forward about this for a while, so just going to have a nice chat about playing with wee men, aren't we? So
yes.
So I was thinking we could maybe like just dive in and sort of start right at the start with you. You know, I think you said that you got into 40k like back in the sort of Rogue Trader era. Is that right?
Well, I guess like most kind of post-Gen X, pre-millennial kind of age, I guess a lot of our listeners are going to be that kind of age. I got into 40k and fantasy around like Rogue Trader 2nd edition kind of crossover. But I grew up like not poor or deprived, but like not very flush with cash or anything like that in my family. So spent most of my time just hanging around the Games Workshop and making a nuisance of myself. And if I had a little bit of money, I got a book and just kind of immersed myself in that world. And it was all around that period. And I think it was quite a bit of a cultural phenomenon then, because I had quite a few peers who were also into it, who encouraged that, and we did play a few games, but it was mostly getting Hero Quest or some old figures out the boot fair or something and playing on the carpet, you know. And playing 40k 2nd edition through the lens of an 11-year-old's eyes is probably quite a different prospect to playing it now. But it was good fun, and it definitely had a massive impact on me. I heard there's like a reminiscence bump from the age of like 11 to 12 through to your mid-20s, where you can remember as an adult, you can remember that period the most. It's like most vivid memories, and definitely it had a big impact on me. But I guess like a lot of us, like late teens, kind of got into other things, you know, music and girls and whatnot, and kind of just dropped it entirely. And it's only relatively recently I've got back into it. Well, there was like a middle section where I got into the fiction. And I was not a very good student. I wasn't very learned. I wasn't well read or anything. Just kind of watched TV, played computer games, went to work, minimum wage, stuffing envelopes. And then I started reading the Gaunt's Ghosts books. And that kind of reactivated this idea of 40k as a universe I could participate in. And that's what led me like kind of to what is currently my current focus in the hobby.
It's interesting that I've heard that a lot, and I'm the same, that folk start reading. It's like one of these warning signs, I suppose. They start reading the Black Library stuff when they've been out the hobby for years. And I did this myself. I remember I started on all the Go Trek and Felix. I did all those, and I remember like I was reading them in bed at night, and it was the actual paper novels. I was getting them second hand or probably like fifth hand. And I remember saying to my wife at one point, like, you know, if I got back into this, what would you think? And she's like, don't bother. And like fast forward a few years, I'm like, I'm just painting this eyeball, leave me alone.
Sorry, I've got this board over here. Just don't worry about it. It's just behind the couch. No big deal.
So it's funny that it's just like a gateway back in those books, isn't it? So.
Yeah, well, there was a very short period, like in my mid-20s, I guess, where I did get briefly back into the hobby. And that was because I met a friend from that earlier point. And all we would do was just go to the pub and just get obliterated. And after a few months of that, I was like, I have to have some shared interest that's not just going and drinking beer. And we both kind of thought, well, what about Wargames? And we'll do that. And that, I didn't get back into Games Workshop games. I think Mantic had just released Kings of War, which is like a rank and flank fantasy game, but quite simple, I guess. And we did that for a little while, and that was actually really good. And it was probably like the first layer of emancipation from Games Workshop. Because I don't know about you, definitely, but when I was a kid, you know, Games Workshop was what it was about. There was I go, you go. It was movement, weapon skill, ballistic skill. It was 2,000 points, 6x4 table. That's exactly how it should be done. And then this kind of little wedge appeared with Kings of War, which has led me down a road, which has ended up in a really rewarding diversification of wargaming and the interests that it can provide. Well, it provides me personally, but I guess it offers outside of the Games Workshop paradigm. And I guess you've the same thing, right? You haven't come back and gone straight to Games Workshop. You've diversified into Rangers of Shadow Deep and Frostgrave and Stargrave and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, exactly the same for me again. Spookily, like it was Kings of War was my first, when I came back and I was like, well, they've ended Warhammer. I don't like the look of this new thing. And then, you Google Warhammer alternatives and the first thing that comes up is Kings of War. So I got into that and got the book and thought, wow, I understand this. And, I played a few games that like I don't really play it these days, but I've still got a place in my heart for it, if that makes sense.
I got some old figures from back in the day as well. My uncle gave me some Rogue Trader figures, like some stuff that's very valuable, and like squats and the thud guns and Rogue Trader Marines and things that are like really desirable to get a hold of. And like as a kid, I didn't really have anyone to help me join the dots, so I didn't even know it was Games Workshop at the time. And I'm like, okay, cool, these are great. So like arrange them on my shelf, or then smother them in red enamel paint because they were like really well painted, or set them on fire or whatever. They didn't understand the context of it all. But coming back to it, I kept a few, and so I've coming back to it. I've still got those, but I don't play Games Workshop games anymore, and I don't feel any the poorer for it. I got this amazing book called 1 Hour Wargames by Neil Thomas, and it's a historical book, and that's one of the arc through Gaunt's Ghosts, which is the 40k novels about the Imperial Guard, into historicals, was that there was so much in those novels that even as a layman, kind of, like I said, not very well read at all, I could be like, right, this is a book about all the commanders are in a big manor house, and then all the guard are going up to the front lines, and it's all trenches and poison gas and artillery and mud and endless slaughter, and it's obviously something to do with World War One. And then I started to like, okay, well, let me look at the source of that. And it's a bit like as you get a bit older, you realize that 40Ks are like all like Judge Dredd and Dune all kind of mixed together in like this crucible that becomes 40K. So I started thinking the same thing about the sources of inspiration for these books, and got interested in history in general. And then I realized that these two things can combine. And I had looked at, I think it's like Wargames Illustrated or something when I was a bit younger, couldn't get White Dwarf. So I just picked this thing up, and just being so bored, like it was so dry and so uninteresting. I don't know if that was a reflection of where historical wargaming was at the time, or just because I was so used to this like dialed up to 11 maximum that Games Workshop provides. There is literally nothing which is average. Everything is like the biggest, the most deadly, the most explosive, the most torturous. It's psychic powers and planets exploding and stuff like so. So going and looking at something which is, by comparison, fairly mundane was completely unpalatable. But coming through kind of a different way, and through the paradigm of these Gaunt's Ghost novels, and there's like lots of different ones. Like this is clearly Stalingrad, this is Verdun, and so on. And then getting into it that way, and content creators like Dan Carlin does hardcore history, very Hollywood history, but like very accessible. I realized that actually there's so much in this world that you can in the real world that you can enjoy through wargaming. That it's definitely worth looking into. And early on, I tried DBA, which is a very like chess-like game, which I didn't really resonate with. But this like 1 Hour Wargames book, the first half of it is I think 5 rule sets from ancients through to modern day or early 20th century, and then the other half is scenarios, and the rules are super duper simple. You can put them on a like one page quite easily, and that got me back into the hobby as an adult in a really real way. Because, Neil, the author says, well, the idea of a Perry Twins kind of table tennis sized table with 1,000 28mm troops is all well and good, but the average person doesn't have the money or the time or whatever for that. And actually, you can look at this 1 Hour Wargames. Well, you've got a maximum, I think, of 6 units in the game. And the units can be as big as you want, but ultimately it's 6 objects, 6 individual things, whether they're mortars and tanks or spearmen or pikemen or whatever it is. And you play on a 2x2 or a 3x3 table, and it's very highly narrative. So you have, like I said, 30 scenarios in. There's like 10 scenarios about scouting and engagements and escalations and things, and then 10 scenarios about a fight that's already in progress and you're reinforcing it, or something's changed in that fight, and then another 10 about de-escalation. And you can like simulate these really interesting narrative, context-driven games really quickly. And I played a number of historical rule sets. I think it was for the Napoleonic period, so horse and muskets and chasseurs and cuirassiers and stuff like that. And I played loads of different rules, and including this one, which is, like I said, super simple, very quick. And actually, it was this super simple one was the most enjoyable. And all the results were roughly the same, but this one didn't require me to have bits of paper to note things down. I didn't have to have like loads of unit stats or anything. And it was an absolute revelation to realize I could have wargaming, especially in a historical context, which is typically considered to be quite onerous when it comes to crunch. I think you'll find that the Prussian Jaegers had, they had rifled muskets at a ratio of 1 to 10. So in theory, you should, there's none of that really. It's super duper simple. That gives you a prototypical outcome. You can look at it and you can say, well, these are spearmen and they're going up against slingers and bowmen. You can instinctively know what that relationship is going to look like and play it out. And the strategy is around managing the relationships between those units that you have available to yourself, rather than through special rules and these really like minor distinctions, and come up with a super enjoyable game as well. So I absolutely love this like 1 hour Wargames book.
It looks like you're playing with 2 mil. Like, I know you've got 10 mil as well, but like 2 mil, I've heard very few folk getting into 2 mil. What's the deal there?
So 2 mil historically has been the area most dominated by a company called Irregular, and they do a whole army, many times larger in terms of the people it's meant to represent, many times larger than a fantasy army. I think I bought 2 starter armies for ultimately what's meant to represent French Napoleonic troops, but it really is they're little blocks. They look like almost like undifferentiated blobs, but not quite. And it represents literally thousands of figures. So you think if you've got a spearman unit in Warhammer Fantasy and it's 12 people, well, your unit in 2 mil might be only 4 bases, like 4 small bases. There's like 25 mil bases or something, but that might represent like 4 or 5, not just represent, but it will depict like 400 or 500 figures. So you really zoom out and you can get this absolutely like breathtaking panorama of a battlefield. And obviously the ranges are smaller, but you have whole towns and villages represented on the tabletop. They're not just like 2 buildings. This is a city. Actually, the city itself is maybe 6 or 8 inches wide, not city, but like a town, maybe 6 or 8 inches wide, and you can garrison it and so on. And there are rules which support that. Blucher and Absolute Emperor, they're designed around scales of that kind. But the great thing about 2 mil is that it's super simple to paint, very cheap, very affordable. Gives you a great, if you want to see this like grand aspect, it's fantastic. But historical war games generally, unlike most other, especially games that have closed systems like Games Workshop or Mantic or whatever, they're typically scale agnostic. Most people go 15 mil. I know you started 15 mil, right? But as long as normally you use base widths as the unit of measurement, or if not, there's a proxy for that. So however wide your regiments are, so if you're talking Warhammer Fantasy, you've got 5 figures at the front. That's 100 mil maybe, or 125 mil. The width of that unit is the unit which all other things happen, like how far you move, how far you shoot, and so on. So you can zoom in and zoom out really easily. I use 10 mil as my main scale because I actually went down. It's a bit like when in that period where I wasn't into wargaming, I got really into like heavy metal, and I don't know what about my character that just means I have to just push to the absolute extreme for everything as quickly as possible, regardless of whether I enjoy it. So I went like straight to Swedish death metal, and it was absolutely unlistenable. But I was that was the the most extreme. And so for wargaming, I was like, right, well, I want the smallest, and I want the most scope, and I want the most complex, and then like explored all these options. Actually found out that like if you want the most balanced game, it's ultimately not a war game, right? It's like play Go or chess or something. If you want the most crunch, play. Have you heard of Advanced Squad Leader? It's not a miniatures game, it's a counters game, but the idea that like it's down to individuals, and you can capture somebody or the opponent and interrogate them and find out the location of other hidden forces on the same map that exist, and it's so crunchy. There's like 4 or 5 different firing phases in each turn, and if you want to have strategy and tactics, like that's the game. It's not with figures actually. So that's why I went with 2 mil, because I was like, well, I'll get the most number of forces on the battlefield. But I realized I needed something. I couldn't relate to it because they really are just blobs, especially if you're standing at kind of like normal distance from a table. So I compromised at 10 mil, and I personally think 10 mil is the absolute king of scales. And I mentioned this on the Discord, and there was like a spirited discussion about how true that was. but in my mind, you get the ease of painting of 6 mil by a massive amount. But because they're double the size of 6 mil, or just under double the size, they capture the light a lot more easily. I don't know if you've noticed, but if you look at 6 mil on the table, it tends to be quite dark unless you really have great lighting, which I don't. And so you have to paint the figures super, super bright to stand out. So with 10 mil, you have way less of that effect. And you can do a little bit of, you can't really do modeling on it, really. You kind of get the figures as they are and you arrange them as you want, but they look individual. So I've got quite a few. I've got like a big English Civil War thing, and I'm starting a 18th century horse and musket thing in 10 mil. And I tried, I know you've done Rangers of Shadow Deep in 28 and A Song of Blazing Heroes. And I got so wrapped up in this idea that I wanted to do more in depth, rather than unit versus unit. I wanted individuals, and almost that kind of RPG thing. And I looked at 5 Leagues to the Borderlands, and I printed up some figures in 15 mil and played that. And so 15 mil figures on a 10 mil scenery actually works out okay, and it looks really great. But I realized that's just not for me at all. Like 10 honestly, 10 rank and flank 10 mil is absolutely where it's at.
Do you think there's much? I mean, there's 5 mil of difference. I was going to say, do you think there's much difference between 10 and 15?
Well, it's like the cube, isn't it? It's not just, that's just one direction, 5 mil in one direction, but then 5 mil in another direction, and 5 mil in another direction. So it's like, in terms of mass, 15 mil is way bigger than 10 mil.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, but I'm not getting a new scale, so not another one.
That horse was bolted. I guess if you're primarily into like individual casualty removal, which is what you've shown on your blog, you've got the individually based 15 mil miniatures, right? Individual casualty removal. Once when someone dies, you take them off. And that's definitely a Warhammer Fantasy 1-page rules type mechanism, which is obviously super valid. But it's not something I'm that interested in. Typically, I'm looking at unit degradation. And so I have a unit of however many bases, so like 1, 2, 3, or 4 bases is a unit. And that unit just more or less stays, on terms of the tabletop at least, stays as it is. I maybe have a dice to represent how much damage it's taken. I use the Rampant rule set, so Dragon Rampant, Lion Rampant, Pikeman's Lament, and the only degradation a unit takes is when it has more than 50% casualties. So because I don't remove any figures, I just put a little casualty marker next to them, and that says, okay, well, they've taken this amount of damage, and they're less efficient in fighting, or less resilient, or whatever it is. And that works well in terms of time as well, because you're not removing individual figures, you're not re-ranking. That works pretty well too.
It's funny that I've done that, because the rule sets that I would play with, I mean, we've talked about Kings of War, Mayhem, I know you've tried that, and we'll maybe talk about that in a second, but that's pretty much multi-base. But it was only an aesthetic thing for me. I thought, I want to make these armies look a bit like they did in White Dwarf in the 90s at 28. But I'm not going to be taking the figures off, so it's actually stupid that I'm doing that. But, I am pretty stupid, so...
Well, it was the chap from not Chain of Command, Crown of Command, who was like so fastidiously replicating White Dwarf photographs that, you know, the different heavy metal studio painters painting the bases with slightly different paints for like a certain regiment, and you can see in the photographs that the bases are different colors. And then I think it's Josh. He's then replicating the difference in tone in his version of those figures, which is, you got to admire the tenacity and the attention to detail. But that's not my bag at all.
It worries me that people could see such differences in colours, because I've talked about it before. Like, I'm pretty badly colourblind, and I wonder when I put photos of stuff I've painted up. Like, it looks fine to me, but I wonder, like, that there are things here I can't see that must look outrageous. So, but what can you do? What can you do? Mayhem, you weren't that keen on it, were you?
So I've definitely churned through my assortment of rules. Like, I don't say I'm collecting them necessarily. I play almost entirely solo, and I would say like, as a rule, I play solo. I got my stepbrother's kind of into it, and if I set everything up and he happens to be here, then he'll play a game. But generally, I'm playing against myself. So that's one thing. So I don't have another person to help me with the rules or what I'm doing wrong, and that's kind of part of the reason why I think the 1 hour wargame stuff is so good. And another book called The Solo Wargaming Guide, which is a super thin book, but it talks about campaigns, and in that it talks about the context around, you don't just have a battle that you just smash people together and then one wins and one loses and that's the end of it, because that gets boring very quickly. But you have context around it, which then drives a narrative, and the fact that you were outnumbered 10-1 and you were absolutely annihilated, but you defended an area long enough for the rest of your army to be in a better position for some other battle, gives you the justification for that. So I've tested lots of different rules, and I'm pretty merciless when it comes to what I enjoy in a rule set and what I don't. I definitely found that the Mayhem rules seemed like they were going to be really good. I created a quick reference sheet for it. I created like a flow diagram, but actually, for that kind of thing, I really like the rampant rules, and I didn't see anything that Mayhem really added to the mix, personally. And that's not saying there's anything wrong with them. One man's wine is another man's vinegar, and all that. It just didn't gel with me. And there's loads of other rules that are available that I personally enjoy more. I mean, it's part of the issue I have with sci-fi and fantasy, and this is a fantasy game, and I've painted up 2 War Master scale, like 10mm armies, Chaos Dwarves and Undead, and that's what I was using in the battles I played, and I've still got to play War Master, so I'll put that to the side for a second. But in general, I kind of feel that there's like not much is really added to a war game when it's like, okay, one of the people is blue-haired and pointy-eared and the other people are humans, but they've got like relatively similar statistics in the game, and they do similar things, and they've both got similar weapons, and they both fight in a very similar way. It kind of feels like there's extra stuff in here that we don't really need. I feel like sci-fi and fantasy's real strength is in the truly bizarre, like Lovecraftian, apocalyptic, cosmic horror, where it is mind-wrenching about what's going on. Imagine Demon Worlds and the Eye of Terror. Like, how you can't model on a tabletop, really. Or in sci-fi, the Shrike from Hyperion, the liquid metal and multidimensional, or manipulating the metric tensor and relativistic weapons and time dilation. All this stuff that you see in sci-fi, where your mind is just stretched in ways that it isn't through conventional fiction. And I feel that you're kind of doing a disservice to those genres by pushing them into the same paradigm as the real world, because the real world intrinsically has, it's quote unquote balanced for what that you instinctively know the strength of bloody Sherman tank against a pike phalanx. Their relationship natively. You don't have to look at the special rules. There's so much depth to it all. You can go very into the details and very accurate, or you can zoom right out. And I feel there's precious little added by that kind of Star Trek anthropomorphic alien, or evil humans with green skin in a rule set. So because Mayhem didn't really set a fire under me, I was quite quick to just put it aside. But I did like Dragon Rampant, and Dragon Rampant is a fantasy game, and it's like I've just said, well, these are dire wolves, but they act exactly the same as light cavalry in every other game, but in this game they're dire wolves or they're lesser beasts or whatever. And that was enjoyable, but I think that was mostly through the game system rather than what it's representing necessarily. Have you played any of the Rampant games?
No, but funnily enough, last night I was reading. I get my copy of Miniature Wargames magazine every month, and there was a cool article. I don't have the magazine on me now because I wish I could credit the author, because they had I could tell by the name kind of that it's about fighting dragons, but the gist of this article was that he wanted to have a warband going up against a single dragon, and what he decided to do, again, I'm assuming this was his own idea, but to make it a bit more interesting, he broke the parts of the dragon up into basically a warband. So it was like claw, head, leg, tail. And you've basically got a warband there. You could destroy a wing. You could destroy the tail. I think you had to destroy the head to kill it. So I thought that was a really cool idea. Just it shows you the different creative ways that you could come up with, just this big powerful monster versus, a warband. So I take it with Dragon Rampant, you're doing more than just fighting a single dragon then, is that?
yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is like, and I guess I'm preaching to the choir here, to you and to your general audience, which is escaping that the GW centric rules about what a game should be and how it should be laid out. And this is not related to just historical war games, but you look at measureless systems where it's grids, diceless systems when it's cards, different turn orders. In Dragon Rampant, like one of the major things that it does is the command and control friction. So there's a really quite well-known independent wargaming company called Two Fat Lardies, and they really focus on the command and control aspects. So your whole army doesn't always act every turn. You have to pick and choose. And so some games do it by rolling a dice and you get this many points, and that many points represents how many orders you can give or whatever. In the Rampant system, you basically roll. Each unit or each class of unit has a number of orders it can take, like move, attack, shoot, or something. And they have target numbers for those orders. So, for example, a pike unit or a unit of knights might be really good at defending and really rubbish at moving around. So you have to decide what order you're going to give and then roll the dice to see if it takes that order or not. And if you fail, sometimes the turn moves to your opponent. So you got to be careful about what you're doing and how much risk you want to take and how much luck you want to try and push to make the things happen that you want to happen. And that's I think that's where Dragon Rampant really shines. And in theory, or the Rampant series in general, in theory, it's a skirmish game. So you're meant to have like 6 to 12 miniatures in each unit, single based, 28 millimeter, blah blah blah. But I don't do that at all. I just use my regiment bases, and I have 2 or 3 bases for each unit. And another thing, this emancipation of the need to adhere to someone else's definition of how rules work. I'm just like, well, I'm just going to use these regiment bases, and actually it works perfectly fine. There's nothing about it that is compromised by that at all. And actually, funny enough, the 1 Hour Wargames book has got a particular way of managing casualties. And someone said, "Oh, yeah, check this one out." And someone has just they've looked at all the statistics about how that works, and they've rewritten it in a much simpler way. So you just literally pull out that entire system about taking casualties and plug in a different one, and it just works perfectly fine. So I can see why something like Dragon Rampant saying, "Well, we're going to have a massive creature as a warband, effectively." Would work really well, because there's so much of that push and pull. Oh, you like this campaign system from this book, but you like the magic system from this book, and you like the order system from this thing. Well, you can just mash them all together, and there's some context is required. Obviously, like you can't just as a rote beginner, you don't even know what you don't know, but very quickly you kind of understand what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy. Like for me, there's a really fantastic Napoleonic game called La Salle by a guy called Sam Mustafa, and it's widely acclaimed as one of the best Napoleonic games there is. because you roll a dice each, and that's how many orders each side gets, and you get pluses and minuses and whatnot. But then you can start doing stuff, and some stuff when you're really far back from the front lines. And things like maybe moving outside of visibility or whatever, you can just do. But as soon as you get really close to an enemy, the enemy, once you've completed your order, whatever it is, like your volley, fire, or you're advancing or whatever, the enemy, if you're close enough, can interrupt your turn and take the initiative, and they can do something. So then they can do something out in the back lines as well, and they can start moving their stuff, or they can immediately try and counteract what you're doing. But then risk you interrupting them after, and so there's this constant back and forth through the turn, and that is playing with another player. That is absolutely the most intense gaming. Through like the system is very simple, but very, very intense. But as a solo player, it's abysmal because I can't manage in my head both me as player one making an action and deciding, knowing ahead of time that player two, i.e. also myself, is going to interrupt that action at the same time. And so that just doesn't work at all. So actually, I prefer the I go, you go, or the hybrid I go, you go systems, because it's a lot simpler to play solo. And you can totally do that, like the rampant system, alternate activations, alternate everything, use the order system, whatever you want. It's really plug and play, really enjoyable.
With your solo games, do you like to start and finish on the same day? Do you ever have just a game set up that you come back to and add a wee bit?
Well, talking about this book where it talks about the modern wargamer is not the one who has in the billiards room we just put a couple of sheets of 8x4 on top of the tables, and we played out a game of Molwitz in 1740, and it took all weekend. Like, I don't think anyone. It's a great idea. Everyone wants to see that stuff, but I think in reality, no one ever does that. Mm-hmm. I definitely don't. So I used to be on the corner of the dining table. A 3x3 board. It can fit on the end of a dining table, okay. But more recently, I've got some fold-up tables in my office, and so I'll play there. But that's what's kind of good about solo gaming, is that you can absolutely play to your own tempo. If you're just bored of a game, like, okay, fine, I'm just going to just pack this away now. You don't have to play through it. You can start whenever you want. You can stop for refreshments whenever you want. And the idea that you're tipping your hand one way or the other, I think it's a bit patently false. I think that's something made up by people who don't want to try it, because especially if you've got context around the game, if it's just an exhibition match equivalent, it's more difficult because the things you've just painted are your favorite, or you don't really care about the other side or whatever it is. It's more difficult. But you can play it all in one go, and it's quite quick, especially if you're using a rule set like 1 hour Wargames. I have used others, and some have taken quite a while. Like, I've got a small YouTube channel, and I played a few games that went on and on and on. There's a great naval war game. And if you're familiar with Battletech kind of originated from naval war games, where you have like unit cards, and there's such a density of action. Like, you might only have like 3 miniatures on the table, but each of those miniatures has like 50 hit points, and they've got 10 guns, and they've got all these different arcs and dice rolls and modifiers for different things going on. And I play the games, whenever I describe them, I get really excited. But actually, when you play them, I don't say they're dull. They do drag on a little. Like Battletech, I guess, to a degree. And that's probably the longest games I've played. And I've recorded some of them and edited them down so much to try and make them watchable. And so I probably don't play those games anymore. I tend to play small games. And if I need to play big games, I might play like the left wing of a battle and then play the right wing of a battle. Like play two sides, or play them in sequence rather than... No, play them chronologically in sequence, i.e. the engagement, the main combat, and then the disengagement afterwards, the rout or the retreat or whatever it is, rather than playing one game which lasts a very long time.
Tell me a wee bit about your YouTube channel, Williams Wargames. When did you kick that off?
So I had a video on a personal channel about a Song of Blades and Heroes, which I know you've played as well. And that was way, way back in the day. And I realized that it was like sandwiched amongst me playing songs on the guitar and stuff like that. It was completely impractical. So I split that into a separate channel because people were still commenting on it and it was getting some traction. And then I a bit like having a diary or a vlog about recording what you've been doing. I wanted to create a channel which would document the war games I was playing, and ideally the campaigns that I'm playing. So I've created the seed of a number of campaigns. But it's only now that I've really got a bit of space, I can set things up repeatedly and film them, and I've got good lighting and so on. I can get into the action. And the idea would be to show a campaign or something over time. I've got I say it's popular is maybe too strong a word. I've got a bigger channel, which is one of my other hobbies, and I enjoy doing that as well. And it's you often hear the aphorism that you only learn through teaching. And I'm not going to pretend like I'm teaching anything. I'm not a historian. I'm a fan of history. I'm not a great wargamer. I just like war games. I'm not a great painter or anything like that. But describing what you're doing and talking about it and showing it helps to reinforce lessons. And I definitely get enjoyment from that too.
Do you tend to record every game you play, or just pick and choose certain games?
I definitely won't record the first game of a certain rule set I'm playing, because that tends to be lots of oh no, and then going back through the book and spending lots of time cross-referencing. Having said that, the Pikeman's Lament games I played, which is English Civil War, I think I played one quick game against myself, and then I started recording. So definitely not all. I'm debating the relative merits of a blog type approach, like White Dwarf article, writing out the bit of fluff and then describing the battle, photographs, diagrams and stuff, which you can also do in book form, obviously, or a video. And I definitely fluctuate between the two, because I for example, when you post something on your blog, I read it, like, generally. But if you posted a video, I wouldn't always have time to watch your video like synchronously. That it's a bit like leaving a voice message versus texting somebody. And so I enjoy both equally, and I can't tell which I should stick with.
Mm-hmm. What about actually recording? I mean, I've never recorded that, like visually recorded a battle report. There'll be lots of things to consider, won't there? Like lighting and stuff like that. And are you using like a single camera and camera angle, or are you kind of what's the kind of setup?
Well, it's extremely rudimentary, and I deliberately keep it so. You look at someone like Grimdark City, I think they're called now, or Guerrilla Miniatures, or Mini Wargaming, or whatever, and they've got special effects and lighting and dry ice and panning and stuff like that. And I haven't got time for that. How you're looking for an answer to something and you Google it for a little while and you're like really worried that you're going to get the wrong answer, but then after 10 minutes of Googling, you still haven't found out what that answer is. The chances are that most people, if they care at all, won't do as much research as you. So actually, it probably doesn't matter. And so I have watched videos that have been filmed with someone holding their camera and waving it around in portrait mode, and found enjoyment to a degree out of them. So I kind of figure that it might be nice to have all the extra like studio lighting and the baffles and the fancy microphone and the SLR camera and the multiple camera angles and so on. But actually, I think if you can tell a compelling story and you can, you don't have to change the camera angle. I tend to zoom in as the battle starts. I'm way out because I'm trying to show everything, and then progressively get narrower and narrower. But that's only 2 or 3 times I'll adjust where the camera is, maybe total. A little tripod that sits next to it. Got a lamp that I put above the table, which has just got like a daylight bulb in it. That's literally it. I'm reminded of like the talking of Stalingrad. There's a book about Berlin. It's called Berlin, and it's about the Red Army's advance on Berlin in World War II. And it starts out with like the army group, and then slowly narrows in focus down to the last tank and the last group of people that are involved in the conflict, actively fighting. And I feel that when a war game does that, rather than just not necessarily as a battle of attrition, but when the focus gets narrower and narrower until there's a crux, a focal point, I think that's very rewarding entirely. And so I kind of mimic that, I guess, with zooming in, but that's as far as I'm going. I did try and add special effects, like sound effects. And someone said, yeah, that's super annoying. So, no, thanks. But they did also say, well, it's nice that you don't sound like you're being, put through this against your will. which I think, and maybe that's the province of historical wargaming, and that there's a perception, at least, that the people who play it are old and grey and boring, and they're very focused on the exact colour of the facings of the Bayern Second Infantry Brigade or whatever. I don't think that's actually true, but there's definitely a perception of that. There's like a legacy of that, and although you have to be a historian to do it. So I'd like to think when someone is a bit more upbeat about it and a bit more laissez-faire about how it goes, it's maybe more interesting for the viewer. So that's what I try and do.
What are you working on at the moment, like painting wise or building wise?
So primarily focus on 10 mil. So I've just finished a Chaos Dwarf army. After talking about how I don't think pointy-haired blue-skinned people add that much, I did really want to try War Master. Excuse me. So I've painted up a Chaos Dwarf army, and I've got an Undead army as well, and I will kind of like smash them against each other at some point. But I've already the Caprice has already fled. So there's a fantastic. I've recently got a 3D printer, like a few months ago, and it's opened up the world to me, especially for 10 mil, because 10 mil has great manufacturers in Pendragon, but they also have a lot of companies will make 6 mil STLs on like My Mini Factory, which you can take and just rescale, or 15 mil and scale down, for example. So you can get a lot more variety through 3D printing than you can commercially. And that's not just for 10 mil, but it's particularly well felt in 10 mil because it's not as common. So there's a great guy who's done, I think, the Army Forger, who's done a big medieval battlefield set. So it's like tents and ruined buildings and what are the catapult things called?
Trebuchets.
Trebuchet, yes. Multiple trebuchets and battering rams and whatnot. So I have managed to avoid doing any medieval stuff so far. I don't know how long that will last, but I've printed out some burnt out buildings that will form part of some scenery. So I've been building a little bit of scenery recently as well, like fields and hedges and stuff. Because I think we all have the mat or the board, and then we have maybe a couple of trees, maybe like the one solitary building that we use in everything. So for me, I've been trying to make it a little bit more varied. So that's what I've been focusing on. And these 2 mil Napoleonic horse and musket stuff, I really enjoy the relationship between the units in that era. Because you've got the cannons, which will obliterate the infantry if they're in close order. And then the infantry in close order will defeat the cavalry, and the cavalry will defeat the infantry in open order. And the open order infantry will defeat the cannons. Like there's like a very obvious relationship between all the units there, so that you can. It's very easy to understand. I definitely appreciate that, but I don't like the 2 mil stuff. Although it's really, really impressive, in like visually in certain aspects, it doesn't resonate with me as much as it would. And I think, like most people, and it's probably to my detriment, the impression I have of the Napoleonic period, despite reading the Aubrey Maturin novels, the Captain O'Brien stuff, and the Sharp novels, I can't really find myself engaged in the Napoleonic period as much as I want. But if I just cast it back another kind of 50 years, where you got tricorn hats and all these like crazy outfits, I know just enough to be dangerous in that. I don't really know much about it at all, but I don't feel kind of pinned down to any like real specific historical accuracy there at all, other than very big generalities. So I'm making up some invented historical fiction armies for the 18th century. So very, very similar kind of relationship between units, but like 50 years earlier. So I've got English Civil War stuff is what's finished, and then this kind of 18th century stuff is starting. There's a chap called Henry Hyde who's recently released a book called Martinstadt, which is about a historical fiction campaign that he ran in like the 80s, I think, about that period as well. And I think that period is particularly attractive because it's not just like the Brits and the Americans and the Germans and the Russians like in the European theatre. Right? There's way more forces involved. I mean, that's like a massive oversimplification. But in that period of like the 18th century, you could basically invent a country, and the layman wouldn't know there to be any difference, and it would seem very authentic. And that gives like very fertile ground for you to put your mark on something without having to be like such a slavish devotee of what actually happened.
Getting the red car syndrome there were you mentioning, Henry, because I just listened to his episode with Josh yesterday, and then he had a book in the magazine last night, Imaginations, I'm sure the series is called.
Yeah, so yeah, that's what I think that's his understanding of how that term has come to be understood as that. And I like I've got his Wargames campaigns book. I haven't. It's behind me, but it's like 2 inches thick. Like this solo wargaming guide contains campaigns, but it's like it's very thin.
What's the book called? Solo
wargaming campaign. The solo wargaming guide.
Yeah. Did Henry write that? Or?
No. This is another chap called William Sylvester. It's basically super distilled. You have ways of running campaigns as an individual that use the same kind of mechanisms that Henry does. And Henry's stuff can be run solo as well, definitely. But Henry will allow you to go to a level of depth that you would think would be impossible to fathom, like what the geographical layout of your imaginary country is, and thus the distribution of agricultural versus mineral wealth, and how that translates to industrialization, and so many steps behind how many cannons you can field or how much the price of cannonballs is, but you can do that if you so desire. But this solo wargaming guide is really like, even if you use it as multiple people, it provides a very concise view on how to run a campaign. Definitely weather. We don't use weather in Wargames, do we? But there's a chart in this where you have your strategically you have your armies moving around a map, for example, and then you chart the weather as the weather goes on. And after a certain amount of days, then it becomes more difficult for, say, artillery to move, and more easy for infantry to forage, or whatever it is, and it changes the paradigm. Or maybe if you've got a game where you're looking at, I keep focusing on horse and musket, but that's not all I'm interested in. But it's a good example of how if it's really raining, then musket fire is going to be really a massive detriment, for example, and you might not be able to bring your guns. You've got rules for sieges. So if you decide that you're not going to go in, you're not going to fight on the battle, and you're going to stay in your castle or whatever, how long the siege lasts and how many people die, and will you sally forth and try and break the siege, and then maybe you have a relieving force, and so then you've got like all these little hooks for tabletop games that you can either adopt and bring on and play a game with them, or just let them go by and use the dice or the cards or whatever it is to determine the results.
Yeah, like it's interesting, like mentioning things like weather and that. Like, I'm not vastly experienced in solo gaming myself at all, but I know Rangers of Shadowdeep relatively well. And then Joe McCulloch has his other book, which is more aimed at Frostgrave. I'm sure it's Perilous Dark, and there's a lot about, if you want to make Frostgrave a solo endeavour, he goes into a lot of that about, because it's more a toolkit than like rules or instructions, but he's saying about, you're going to have to fight the conditions a lot rather than just fighting baddies. Like, the baddies are there, and they'll come at you and they'll fight you. But let's try and, you're up against a dungeon here. There's going to be traps. There's going to be difficult conditions. And that is probably what's going to get you. That's probably what's going to, like, be tougher to overcome than, just a zombie who's walking towards you. So lots of different options there, isn't there?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be for solo gaming. Like you could just roll the dice and see. You're playing a normal battle. Roll the dice after you've deployed. See what the weather's going to be like, or maybe it's dark when you start the battle, and then you have to roll the dice to see when dawn breaks. for example. Maybe there's a comet that flies overhead and it gives, you roll a leadership test on your leader, and whoever succeeds, they think it's an omen that's positive for them, and everyone gets a morale bonus or something. There's all these like tertiary tangential factors which can contribute to a war game that are slightly beyond just the raw statistics that a unit might have. One great example was, if you imagine you've got two armies that are facing each other, and one of them is with more light cavalry, which could be in the ancient world, so you've got the Carthaginians who had like great light cavalry, and you have the Romans who have got lots of great infantry. Well, the light cavalry can screen things. So, assuming they don't die, it means that maybe as the Carthaginian player, or as a player with more light cavalry, the high elves or whatever, you can deploy, rather than deploying your infantry on the table, you can deploy like post-it notes and write what the units are on the back of the post-it notes. But then have like maybe 2 or 3 blank post-it notes to represent your advantage, because you've got cavalry, and so the enemy can't see where your units are. And then only when you turn them over, you reveal, actually, well, they played all their units here to counter me, but I don't actually have any units there. Those were bluffs, and actually the rest of my army is over here. And that's nothing to do with what the effect they have on the tabletop, but it's one level up from that, like a strategic view.
Cool. So it's been a really enjoyable chat, William. Where we've mentioned your YouTube channel and that, so where could the listener find that, and what else could they maybe check out? Where could you send them? So
I'm on the Discord, on the Bedroom Battlefields Tabletop Hobbies Podcast Discord. Williams Wargames. Williams Wargames on YouTube if you so desire. I won't take it personally if you don't. I've got different Wargames battle reports there. As a kind of call to action for anyone who's even remotely interested in what I've been talking about, I'll just reiterate the 2 books which really sent me on this journey and have led to lots of other things. 1 Hour Wargames by Neil Thomas, which is a really concise and condensed set of rules from the ancient world to the present day, and a bunch of scenarios which you can use in any game. It's invaluable. And Solo Wargaming Campaigns by William Sylvester, which gives you a bunch of context you can put around your games to make them more meaningful and more enjoyable, and get miniatures back on the table for game number 2 of something, rather than just leaving it on the wayside. Those are the 2 things I suggest. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I fancy a look at that Solo. I'm doing the old live Amazon thing.
It's called the Solo Wargaming Guide, not the Solo Wargaming Campaigns.
Solo Wargaming Guide. I could get that for £10.95. I might well just buy that right away, because I'm sold on it. Came out in 2013, 10 years ago. Not that matters. I'm just making an observation.
Both those books have got great bibliographies. If you want to dive any further, they will contain a bunch of information. Henry Hyde, as you said, is a great source. But those 2, they're small books and short books, and they'll set you on the right track. And if you're not interested, then you don't have to bother with anything else. But that's what I would recommend.
Lovely stuff. I'm going to dive in, because I always need more books. So thanks so much for your time, William. Really enjoyable chat. We'll get you on again sometime. We'll catch up, and I'll tell you about this book that I'm reading. So.
It's wonderful being here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Tabletop Miniature Hobby Podcast. If you enjoy the show, then please do share it with someone else you think might enjoy it too. And be sure to check out our Discord community of like-minded hobbyists, which you could find at bedroombattlefields.com/Discord. It'd be great to see you in there.